Hi, today's episode is all about niches. We'll discuss how marketers that are looking to become a fractional CMO or may already be operating in a portfolio career need to select and dominate a niche that leverages their strengths and market demands. We'll be discussing the importance of selecting niche, how to conduct skills analysis to identify a niche, and how to apply market research to identify gaps in the market. Our guest today is Dan Gwalter, an executive coach and founder of No Nonsense Leadership. Hi, Dan. Thanks very much for joining us. Before we jump
Hi,
in,
Paul.
can you tell us? Hi. Before we jump in, can you tell listeners and viewers a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, sure thing. So I do two things really. I'm a fractional CTO, and I have been for about 15 years, way back before the word fractional existed. But then alongside that, more recently, I started a coaching practice that helps transitional fractional people. So it helps them understand how to transition into the fractional world, how to set up a business that's sustainable, and really how to work that market effectively. So that's probably a little bit about me. I'm sure we'll find out a bit more as we go through the podcast.
Speaking of niches, you have a bit of a niche hobby, don't you? Do you want to divulge your passion for Western riding?
Well, I think you probably just did it for me, Bob. Yeah, I was that crazy guy that woke up in his 40s and decided he wanted to ride a horse, but then decided not to ride English because I don't like tweed and jodhpurs and all that crazy stuff. So got out and bought an American plane horse and learned to ride snow, and that's my passion hobby. So most weekends, most spare time, I'm out with horses, riding and showing people what Western riding is all about.
And what's the difference between Western riding and normal riding? You can tell I'm a layperson, so I haven't got a clue about horse riding, but what's the difference?
I guess there are lots of different. There are a lot of very subtle differences. But at the end of the day, Paul, a horse is a horse, right? They don't really have no understanding that they're American or English. But in terms of how we approach the topic, Western riding is much more about allowing the horse to think for itself, and in fact, encouraging it to think for itself. So if you ever see Western riders, we ride with very long reins. We don't make a lot of contact on the mouth at all. And then it's much more about the relationship we're able to build with the horses. So it's quite an interesting transition from anybody that's used to seeing English riding. And it is a completely different way of thinking about the bond that you have with the horse and what you're trying to achieve.
Fantastic, and that's probably quite a nice segue, actually. In the word transition for, I guess, people, marketers that are an in-house role. They've been working in the brand for a long time and are thinking about moving into this fractional work style, this portfolio work style. How do you position yourself? What is your niche? And I've spoken to many fractional CMOs over the last year, and I'm always staggered by how many say, well, I'm a bit of a fractional sales officer, but I've been pulled into roles where I've been leading the marketing team, but sometimes I position myself as a fractional chief commercial officer because that's where I've had most commercial success. And for me, when these people are explaining what they do and how they are, I kind of get confused. So what's the importance of selecting the niche? Why do we have to put a lot of energy and focus onto that before we move into this work style?
So I guess from my perspective, that identification of niche is the most important thing to get right. It's the bit you've got to do at the beginning. And there are lots of different ways that I could come at this topic. I guess to start off, from a business perspective, there are very few unique businesses. And that's one of the biggest transitions that people need to make in terms of mindset is you come out of that permanent world where you are an employee and your job title is super important, probably more to you than it is to the organization, but it helps put you in a box. When you come out into the fractional or the consulting or the portfolio world, your job title becomes a lot less relevant. It's more about what you're able to do, the value that you're able to bring to organizations. And so that identification of niche is really about sort of taking a step back and looking at, what we're actually very good at, what you enjoy doing, because let's be honest, it's pointless creating a business that farms you into a line of work that you don't actually enjoy. So I guess for me, it becomes less about job title, more about value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right there. So in terms of identifying where that market demand is, what your personal strengths are, because obviously as a fractional CMO, there will be certain bits of marketing that you really, really enjoy doing, and you're probably going to want to get out of bed to do those kind of things. and not get out of bed to do the things that you don't really like doing. So how do you find that alignment between what the market wants, but also your own, I guess, personal strengths?
I guess to a certain extent, luck definitely plays a part in that. From time to time, I meet people who the thing they don't enjoy doing happens to be the thing the market wants, and that's just unfortunate. And I can't, you can't avoid that. But you can certainly create a market for yourself that dominates on the topics that you really enjoy. If I look at how most people transition into fractional work, it tends to happen that, they dump themselves out of corporate life without really having too much of an idea what they want to do. And then via word of mouth or referral or their network, that opportunity to go and do something happens. And before you know it, that's become their thing. Well, that's not a bad word, Jim, yet, I guess. But it certainly helps if you actually take a conscious moment to sit and think, what is my message to the market? And I guess we're going to come on to that a lot more in other podcast episodes or a bit later in this session. Is the reality is nobody wants to go and buy a Swiss Army knife. It just isn't happening right now, certainly in any of the industries that I work within. People are hiring fractionals because they are specialists with experience that are able to come on board and quickly get outcomes that are needed. And that's all part and parcel of that niching down exercise.
And I guess that niching down exercise, it sounds like a person wanting to come into a fractional role, or maybe people who are already positioning themselves as a fractional CMO, but maybe not getting traction. One of the reasons for not getting traction is they haven't identified their niche. Their message is complicated, it's confusing. So what are the steps a marketer can take to identify their niche? You'd think naturally that a marketer of all professions would find this easy, but they don't, do they? So how do you go about, let's say, conducting a skills analysis of what you're good at, what you're bad at, and how can you analyze feedback on what people think of you or how people perceive you and your past experiences to kind of feel that narrative?
So I've spoken to many people about this over the years, and the way that I approach this topic, certainly if I'm being asked to coach it, is start off with the last good CV. It's probably the last time you actually need it, because in reality, fractionals very rarely have to show CVs. They need to be able to talk about their experiences relevant to the clients they're talking about. But start off with that CV and have a look through it, the things that you thought were good, that you called out and suggested were achievements worthy of note. And that's a very good starting place, is those achievements. The next thing I would suggest is speak to people that know you well, not necessarily spouses, because they don't often give a good commercial balanced view of the world. But certainly speak to former managers, former CEOs that you've worked with, former clients if you've been in a consulting type environment, and just try and have those open conversations about what did they feel was the value that you brought into the role, because somewhere between those two things is your niche. And I think most people have, in my experience, when I do this exercise, it normally takes about a week. If I'm honest, if we do like a 7-week program for new fractionals, the first week is all about the niche and ideal customer. Normally by the end of that week, there's a fairly clear view, but unfortunately, everybody does the same thing. Everybody resists pushing themselves into a very narrow niche. It's almost like people believe that they're hiding themselves from a market, or that they're not showing their full skill potential. And I can't emphasize enough, it's not about hiding, and it's not about not showing your full potential. It's about actually talking to people that have the problems that you understand. Once you're in those conversations, those skills can start to be shown, and you can stretch what it is you do for those clients. If you don't niche down, the reality is that your message becomes incredibly muddy. And instead of talking to one person about one problem, you end up talking to nobody. And that's why people don't get traction.
And how do you, I guess, when you're speaking to marketers or anyone coming to this fractional world, if someone has their own view of where their strengths are, but if their network are telling them, actually, we see your value somewhere else, if that somewhere else is somewhere where I'm not particularly comfortable with, or it's a thing that I don't like doing, what happens then? How do you coach someone around that kind of discrepancy?
It's a really difficult place to find yourself. I'm not going to lie. I have worked with a few, certainly on the sort of technical roles, where people have been told by their network that the thing that they're actually really, really good at is something they can't stand doing. And I guess it really becomes about what at what level you're undertaking. I think that's something that people need to really remember when you transition into fractional is you could be a fractional at an advisory level, so you're not actually doing it, you're simply advising the best way to get it done. And in that regard, you could end up advising organizations how to achieve things that without actually ever having to execute them. Or if it's something that you genuinely do enjoy doing, then you come further down the tree and you become that sort of hybrid. There's advisory on one side of the equation, there's execution on the other. So I think it's relatively easy to work around. If somebody's absolutely adamant, I just don't want to be doing that thing, then you can find your way around it. Most recently, I worked with somebody that is they're a strategic advisor by trade. Transitioning into a fractional world, they want to work with lots of organizations, they want to work with CEOs. And the challenge point was actually what you're really, really good at is coaching. These strategic advisor roles can easily transform into CEO coaching or executive coaching. And their viewpoint was, I don't want to go into that one-to-one coaching model because it's not what I'm passionate, it's not what I enjoy. So we really created a model for them that allowed them to start the journey with the CEO, but quite quickly move downwards through the rest of the executive team to try and work at that level. So they're coaching on a group basis rather than on a single one-to-one basis. So there's always a path. You just have to sometimes you have to think a little bit more laterally than you would imagine.
Sure. And I guess another thing around this, identifying your niche, there's, I guess, the actual niche in terms of your expertise that you can offer to the market. I guess one of the nuances of being a fractional, and I guess one of the value propositions that a fractional person brings is that they work in different industries because they have that flexibility and adaptability to take their knowledge into different sectors and maybe with different size companies. So how do you craft that into your niche? Because for me personally, I've most of my career has been in professional services, so law firms, accountancy, insurance, financial planning. That's what people kind of know me for. But I know that I can actually take my expertise into medical devices, auto, SaaS. How would you coach someone who has a transferable skill set that can be equally applied in any sector, but they're probably known for one sector? How do you sort of coach people around that?
It's a really good question. It's a really interesting point. My opinion is that I guess the answer to that is very much determined on the length of the runway that the person has. So I speak to people that are in every stage of their transition. Some of them are still full-time employed and are considering their transitions. They've got, technically an unlimited runway to do all of the required background activity before going to market. Other people are being made redundant, so they're sitting on healthy bank balances. They've got 6 to 12 months. They don't have to worry financially. And then finally, you've got people that have either quit their jobs, don't have a financial future, or have been struggling to get this right for a number of months. So they're up against it. So for me, the first place to start is in the market that you understand, the one that is going to know you. So, and the reason I say that is each market has a completely different language set. If you look at the language used by, for example, marketeers in financial services versus manufacturing, it will be fundamentally different. And so you kind of stick out like a sore thumb on day one if you're not from that background. However, once you've created a foundation in your original target market, there's nothing stopping you building upon that by layering in new markets. And the way we approach that is still part of that niching exercise. So when we think about niching, I guess it covers two specific things. It covers what are you going to do and who are you going to do it for? So the niche and the ideal customer profile. So certainly when I coach people, it's not uncommon as an outcome to end up with multiple niches and multiple ideal customer profiles from which you would select one pair as your go-to-market, and you would focus exclusively on that pair for a sensible enough amount of time to make sure that you've proven that it will either work or it won't. If it works, then layer in either a new ideal customer profile or layer in a new niche. If it doesn't work, then pick a whole new parent and go again. Does that make sense? I think I covered it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I guess going through that process, there's probably a process that most marketers are pretty au fait with, which is market research. So how can a marketer leverage their knowledge of market research to identify the opportunity, to identify the niche and the ICP? What sort of tools would you recommend they use? How do they sort of go about finding those gaps and opportunities in the market?
Well, Paul, we're 20 minutes in and we're going to talk about AI for the first time. I'm sure it's going to come up again. Most people I speak to have got a fairly clear idea of what their ideal customer is and what their niche is. They think they do anyway. But the reality is when they write it down for the first time, there is a formula, there is a structure to that. They soon realize that actually they may understand where they want to work, they may understand what they want to do, but there is a hell of a lot more to it than that. When you start talking about problems and symptoms and value and offers, it suddenly opens up and becomes a lot more complex. Now, for me, certainly over the last 2 years, tools like ChatGPT and Perplexity have really come into their own in that sort of ideation and research capability. Certainly Perplexity by AI. I can now take a very, very basic niche and ICP definition and do a hell of a lot of market research into the size of the market, the validity of the market, the problems that those ICPs are most likely having, or the symptoms of those problems, and then how somebody with my experience could be of value to them. And that really becomes the sort of foundational market research that sort of layers on what the traditional fractional already is understanding in their own mind.
That's great advice. And yeah, I use AI every day for that very reason. It's looking at my ICP. I've got a very detailed ICP. I know the trigger points. I know the motivations to buy. I know the problems they're going to have. So that really helps me craft the right narrative when I go to market.
Well, I guess on that topic of niche, you've spent some time, you've invested, and you found your niche in your ideal customer profile. Has that been static since day one? Once you've worked it out and established it, has it remained the same, or have you had to refine it and work on that iteratively? What's your view on that?
I've worked on it iteratively, really, because as my knowledge of AI is increasing, as more tools are coming out like Perplexity, I've only just got into Perplexity, so I've been constantly refining my ICP. I've been going deeper and deeper and deeper, because I think the deeper you go, the more nuanced you can get, the more specific the problems you can identify. You can be more specific about the motivation of someone wanting to buy your services. You can go deeper into the objections that person may have about hiring your services over a full-time marketer, for example. So I constantly refine my ICP, how they operate, and also how I respond to those challenges through my own outreach and marketing.
It's a really interesting topic, and for everybody that I've ever worked with, help them establish their ICP and their niche. I see every stage of human emotion as they go through this process. I guess it's only once you've been through that process once that you realize how detailed you have to be. But what I would say to anybody listening in is, in an ideal world, I would like to understand my ideal customer better than they understand themselves. And that's not just because I'm nosy. It's because it does give me an edge. If I look at the fundamental differences between maybe a CEO in a startup pre-seed organization versus a CEO in a Series A type organization, the pressures, the problems they're facing, the stresses of having investors versus not having investors creates a fundamentally different dynamic. And this is why that narrow niche is so important. Is if I just said CEO of financial services companies, well, that's incredibly broad. And there are hundreds of different types. If I go down another level and say, actually, CEOs of financial services companies whose organizations are post Series A, but are looking to achieve rapid growth in the UK with less than 500 staff, suddenly you can really clearly see what the likely challenges are in that organization. And I just don't think you could ever do that if you didn't approach the niche down topic. I'm sure we will continue this conversation on with other episodes, and I think we've probably covered niching to death.
Yeah, I think so. That's probably a good point to break there, Dan. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for your expert insights. I hope our audience have found a lot of value in what you've kind of come up with today, and they've learned how they can take what you've just mentioned and your advice and take that into the next part of their career if they go down that fractional route. So just as a heads up, in our next episode, we'll be discussing how senior marketing executives can reinvent their career narrative to become an effective fractional marketer. So look out for that one. Dan, thank you again, and I look forward to you joining us on our next episode.
Thanks, Paul.